Hey guys, my name is Tensor. Welcome back to the Introduction to Flutter tutorial series. In today's video, we're going to be looking at how to lay things out in Flutter. If you've done any iOS programming, then you're most likely used to creating layouts graphically using an interface builder like the one on the screen. All you're really doing is dragging UI elements onto a storyboard, and then you use your mouse to add the constraints. If you come from Android, on the other hand, then you're probably comfortable using the layout editor for creating layouts graphically, or you're comfortable just building the layouts in XML. If you're coming from the web as well, then you're probably equally used to using a markdown language like HTML to build out your layouts. This is in stark contrast to the way that we build layouts in Flutter, which is programmatically. When people first look at Flutter code, they generally express concern with the amount of nesting and what essentially looks like callback hell. All of the code here is the actual user interface. We don't have a markdown language, and we do not have any kind of graphical user interface which we can use to build our layouts. That being said, creating widget layouts programmatically does take a change in thinking, but that change doesn't need to be a difficult one. And so in this lesson, we're going to explore the basic building blocks of Flutter layouts and how we can use them to create more complex user interfaces. As an aside, I would argue that Flutter's method of building things programmatically and declaratively can be much more powerful than XML or HTML or even graphical UI builders, but I won't really get into that right now. Before we get started though, I do want to point out that there is a web app called Flutter Studio, which is essentially just a graphical interface builder, and you can use it to just drag and drop widgets and then see the actual generated source code after. I highly recommend that all of you guys come to this website and just play around with it for a bit. It can help you get used to the whole building UIs with code idea. Let's start with a very basic example. So we've got a My App stateless widget, which builds out a material application. Inside of it, it's got the theme data, which is making the app bar blue like that. And then it is building out this My Homepage. Inside of our My Homepage stateless widget, we have the scaffold widget. And then inside of the scaffold, we have an app bar, and we have a text widget in the body. And if we actually look at the preview for this application, you can see that we get the app bar at the very top, and then we just have this piece of text, and it's pushed up to the very top and to the left. In the last video, we mentioned that everything in the Flutter UI is a widget. And of course, this doesn't only apply to structural elements like text and buttons. This applies to layout elements like padding and rows. To demonstrate this, I've created a padding widget which now surrounds the text widget. The padding widget has now added padding to all sides of this widget, pushing it away from the left side of the screen and down from the bottom of the app bar. If we actually look at the padding widget here, you can see that the padding widget has this padding property, which takes in a edge insets type. The edge insets types has multiple different named constructors that you can use. So there's edge insets from LTRB, and this just stands for left, top, right, and bottom. This constructor allows you to set left, top, right, and bottom independently of one another. We then have the edge insets all constructor, which allows us to specify one single value which we want to set all of these values to. Then we've got this edge insets only constructor, which allows us to set one or more of these properties. If we wanted to have a padding to the left, but we didn't want to have padding on the top, right, or bottom, we could just set the left property inside of this constructor and then leave the rest of them alone. And then finally, we have this edge insets symmetrical constructor, which takes in two values, a vertical and a horizontal value. And the vertical value will set top and bottom to the same value, and horizontal will then set left and right to the same value. These different constructors are very useful, especially when you want to lay out your widgets in a very specific way. So in this case, we're using edge insets all, and I've passed in a 50 pixel amount. And so what this does is it puts 50 pixels on the left, 50 pixels on the top, 50 pixels on the right, and then 50 pixels on the bottom. But of course, because we have nothing below or to the right of this widget, we don't actually see that padding. Now what if we just want to realign our text? Say we want to put the text itself in the center of this body square. Well, we have a pretty nifty widget here called center. Center will take the child and then put it in the center of whatever it's a child of. In this case, it's a child of the scaffold's body. The text will now appear in the very center of this body rectangle. Now, center is a special widget in that it will center any widget that's inside of it. But of course, we have the ability to align widgets anywhere on the screen that we want to. For this, we have a widget called align, and align has a property inside of it called alignment. Notice I've put the align widget around the text widget, and I've specified that the alignment should be alignment center, and of course this will act exactly like our center widget did. If we take a look at this alignment type, which is just a enum type, you can see that we've got quite a few values here, which allow us to specifically align the widget inside of its parent. So if I want to put the text in the top right, I could just add the alignment top right. We can also specifically use the alignment object and its constructor to specify where in the local coordinate plane system we want to have our widget. So you can see here that I'm passing in 0, 0, and 0, 0 for x and then for y, and our text is still in the center of our screen. So if I put in 1 and 1 for both x and y, you can see here that our text gets pushed to the bottom right. If we put 0.0 in here for the y coordinate, you can see that the text gets centered vertically, but it stays on the right. And of course, if we want to, we can use decimal values. If you want to, you can put in values that are out of the range of -1 and 1. And this will take the widget and position it outside of the parent. But if you want to align the widget in the parent, then you want to keep the values between -1 and 1. Now let's say we want to combine the alignment and the padding together. We could, of course, nest this align widget inside of a padding widget, and that would give the entire widget some padding. But a better way to do this is to use a normal container. If we look at the code for the container here, you can see that it has properties for alignment, it has properties for padding, it has color properties, decoration properties, width and height, and margin, transform, and so on. And interestingly enough, if we come down to the build function here, you can see that based on the property that you set in here, it will add that specific widget to the actual container. So with our container here, I've specified the alignment, and I want it in the top center, and then I've added padding and a margin. If we drill into the widget tree of the actual container, you can see here that it's a container with a padding inside of it, another padding inside of it, and then an align. And then at the very bottom, you can see here that we have our actual text widget. If we go ahead and pull all the properties out and we go and look at the container's widget tree, you can see that it's just the container with the text inside of it. Now, all of the widgets that we've looked at thus far have the ability to take only one child, though it's often necessary to arrange multiple widgets together. And so let's take a look at rows, columns, and stacks. Let's first take a look at the row. So the row has a property called children, which takes in a list of widget type, and you can just specify the widgets inside of the row like this. So we've got an icon, and that's the icon here. Then we've got a text that just says some text, and then we've got a container with a color of blue, and then a width and height of 10.0, and we're just repeating that 3 times. The row, of course, will go horizontally, whereas a column will go vertically. So if we replace the row with a column, you can see here that the icon is at the very top, then we have our text, and then we have our container, and then that repeats 3 times. Now, what happens if we want to take the contents of a row or a column, and we want them to be spaced evenly across the screen? Now, let's say that we want to take our widgets and have them be evenly spaced inside of our column. There are multiple ways that we could do this, though one of the easiest ways is to use what's called an expanded. If we look at the layout, the icons are now spaced out at 1/3 intervals down the body rectangle. If I now add more icons, you can see that they're now spaced closer together, but they're still spaced evenly across this parent. Of course, the same goes for the row, so if I change the column back into a row, you can see that these are now still evenly spaced out horizontally. Now the expanded widget tries to take up as much space as it can, so it essentially just fills in the space that's left over. And we can see this quite clearly if we only leave one of the icons inside of an expanded. So the expanded itself will actually take up a space from here all the way to here, and then these icons get drawn like that, and they only take up the space that they can on the screen. The expanded widget has a property called flex. The flex basically tells the expanded how much space it should take up. If we only have two icons here, and we give one of them a flex of say 3, and then another one a flex of say 7, you can see that the first one actually takes up less space than the second one. And so the higher the flex number, the more space that the expanded will try to take up with respect to other expandeds inside of the column or the row. If I put the 7 flex expanded back down to say 1, then the 3 flex expanded will take up most of this row. Now let's take a look at the stack widget. So here we have a stack widget that has 6 different icons inside of it, and notice that we only see one icon. This is because the stack takes all of its children and then it stacks them on top of one another. So visually we only see the one icon, but in reality we have 6 different icons overlaid on top of one another. Along with the stack, we also have a widget called positioned. The positioned widget specifically is used with the stack to position a child inside of the stack. If I increase the size of the stack to the size of the actual parent by using a container and specifying the width and the height, I can then show you how these positioned widgets work. If we look here, we have a positioned where we've specified that we want the right to be 10.0 pixels. And this widget will be this one here, which is 10 pixels away from the right side of the container, or the screen in this case. Then we have a positioned which is 10 pixels away from the left, which would be this one. We have one that is 10 pixels away from the top, which would be this one. And then we have one that is 10 pixels away from the bottom, which would be this one. If I wanted to, I could take that overlapping icon and push it down to the bottom right-hand corner, and I can do this by specifying 2 specific positions inside of the positioned widgets. This one uses the bottom and the right as its constraint, and so it's 10 pixels from the bottom and 10 pixels from the right. Notice when I put right and left at say 10 pixels like this, obviously we can't draw the icon so that it's within 10 pixels of the left and the right, so it just puts it in the center horizontally. The same is the case if we put in the top and the bottom position as well. You can see here now this icon is completely centered inside of the parent. Now Flutter has a ton of other complex layout widgets like the list view, the grid view, and the scaffold itself, but we're not really going to cover them right now. Instead, we're going to try to recreate a layout that I've created inside of Paint. So this is what the layout is going to look like. We're going to have this circular picture at the top. Then we'll have a name, and then after it we'll have smaller text, which will be a job title, and then below it we'll have these 2 boxes with a divider in between. If we actually look at the layout, then you'll notice that the layout itself is essentially just a column. So we've got a bunch of widgets inside of a column, and then of course some of these widgets are rows like these 2 boxes. So we'll set our body up to be a column, and then we'll start at the top and we'll work our way down. So first we'll start with the column, and then inside of it we'll put in what's called a circle avatar so that we can put our image in there and have it be a circle. And for the circle avatar we can specify a property called background image, which takes in what's called an image provider, and in this case we're passing in what's called a network image, which goes to a URL and gets that image. We're using the Lorem Pixum image generator. Then we can specify a radius for the circle avatar, and in this case I'm giving it 50 pixels. Our image is at the top left-hand corner of the screen. Let's center it vertically. So we can go ahead and add the main axis alignment property to the column and specify it as main axis alignment center. By default, this image is at the far left of this screen. This is not really something that we need to address right now because as we lay out the rest of our widgets, it will go ahead and correct itself. Now below the circle image, we have two pieces of text and then we have a divider. So let's go ahead and add those text widgets. So here we've added the two text widgets, some name and job title. Now we need to add the styling for both of these text widgets. To style these two pieces of text, we add a property called style to the text widget, and then we add in a text style widget, and inside of the text style widget we can change things like the color, the font weight, and then the font size. Our sum text will have a color of blue-gray, then it will have a font weight of bold, and then a font size of 40 pixels. Then job title will have a color of green with a tinting of 400. Notice each of the colors has its own tinting. Then it has a font size of 20. A letter spacing of 2.5, so the letters are further apart than the sum name, and then it has a font weight of bold like sum name as well. Now let's go ahead and add our divider. So the divider goes below the two text widgets and the image. As soon as we add the divider, everything gets centered horizontally in our screen. This is because the divider goes across the entire screen. If we go back to our layout example, you can see here that the divider doesn't quite go across the entire screen, and so we want to do that with our app as well. There are multiple ways that we could accomplish this. We could specify in the divider two properties called indent and end indent. The indent is the left side of the divider, and then the end indent is the right side of the divider. The other easy way that we could do this is by adding a padding to the divider. We've wrapped the divider widget itself inside of a padding. It now raises the text and the image, and it also gives us those spaces on the sides. Of course, we do not want to have a bunch of padding between the divider and the two text widgets. We can use edge inset symmetric, and we can specify the horizontal to be 50 pixels, which will make it so that the left and right both have 50 pixels worth of padding. Alright, so now we have the image, we have the two text widgets, and we have the divider. Let's move down to our two boxes. To create these boxes, let's go ahead and create a container, and then inside of the container we'll have a row, and in the row we'll have an icon and a text widget. And so as it is now, our widgets look like this. Now rather than centering everything using the rows cross-axis alignment, I'm going to add a margin to the container. And I've also made it so that our container has a 50 pixel height. So for the margin, we're using edge inset symmetric, and we're putting in vertical of 10 pixels and then a horizontal of 25 pixels. This will push our row over by 25 pixels. We can further space everything out by adding padding directly to the icon and the text widget. The phone icon gets pushed over to just before where the divider starts, and then the phone number gets pushed over further from that. For the icon, we've put in edge insets only left 10, and then for the text, we put in edge insets only left 30. Now let's go ahead and color our icon and our text. With the icon, it's just a matter of changing a property color to colors green, and then with the text, we need to add the style, which is the text style widget, and add in the color. We also want to make the font a little bigger, so we'll add a font size of 16. Now, most of our widget is finished, but we also want to get this elevation. We can use what's called a material widget. Unfortunately, the container itself doesn't have an elevation property, but the material widget does. And so what I've done is wrapped the row inside of this material widget, and then I've given it a property of 10.0 for the elevation. We now have this box that looks like it's popping out from the background. The last thing that we want to do is create the second box in our layout. And for this, we can just reuse the code for our first box. To clean up our code, what I'm going to do is just create a new stateless widget called InfoBox and then have it build out the code that we just created. And I'm going to go ahead and replace the phone number and the icon here with values that we can pass into the InfoBox constructor. So for this to work, we just need to give our info box two new fields, one which is a string, and then the other one which is icon data. And then we need to pass those into the constructor so that we can specify them when we actually create this widget in our tree. Then we can go down into the widget code and just replace the icon with our icon data field, and then the text with the text field. So now when we create our first info box, we just pass in the text, which is our phone number, and then the icon, which is the icon's phone icon. And then, of course, we can create another info box, which will give us the second box inside of our layout. And for this info box, we want to put in an email, and then we want to change the icon to be icon's email. And there we go. So we have text test@test.com, and then we have icon's email. And finally, we have our layout finished, and it looks quite a bit like the one that I created in this program. Alright guys, well that's it for this tutorial. As we move forward through this series, we're going to go a little bit deeper into the how and why of how the layout and the renderer works. And so you'll understand some of the more finer details about why I did these things the way I did them for this particular app. But for now, I'm hoping that you've got a nice grasp of the basics of laying out things in Flutter. If you like this tutorial, feel free to subscribe and like. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the box below. And if you dislike this video, then by all means, downvote it as much as you like. If you want to catch the next Intro to Flutter video, feel free to click the little notification bell. And I'll see you guys next time. Have a good night.